Hi everybody, welcome back. This is the second video of chapter 13, fiscal policy. So in the previous video, at the end of the previous video, we talked about two different types of fiscal policy: automatic fiscal policy and discretionary fiscal policy. Before we talk about the two types of discretionary fiscal policy that are expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy, we should talk about something that you also, if you look at the notes, you can find they're called government expenditure multiplier and tax multiplier. What do they mean? They're all related to aggregate demand and aggregate supply model we had in chapter 12. So again, if you don't recall aggregate demand, aggregate supply, pause the video, go back to chapter 12, review aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and then come back here again, okay? But if you do remember aggregate demand and aggregate supply, let's talk about the government multiplier, okay? What does it mean? So if you remember, G was part of, or government spending was part of the aggregate demand, one of the factors that can shift aggregate demand, remember? So when the government spending changes, it will impact the aggregate demand, but it has a bigger impact on aggregate demand over time, okay? That's why we call it multiplier. So if government increases its own spending, directly aggregate demand will increase. Aggregate demand will shift rightwards. At the new equilibrium, we have more output. Aggregate demand increased, so the level of real GDP will increase at the new equilibrium. Now people have more money to spend because GDP is the nation's income. As a result, they are going to spend more. So the C component in aggregate demand this time is increasing. If C component increases, consumption expenditures, aggregate demand one more time will increase. So we have another rightward shift in aggregate demand. So aggregate demand will go up for the second time. Again, at the new equilibrium, we have more output, more GDP. So people are going to spend more. So again, aggregate demand will increase through how much money we spend, C component, right? So aggregate demand one more time will shift to the right. That's the multiplier effect. We started with government spending, increasing government spending, but we see a huge increase in aggregate demand that is happening step by step. That's the multiplier effect. Same thing is happening when we change the taxes. So let's say the government introduces a tax cut, okay? So if tax cut happens, it means that we have more money to spend, right? We have more disposable income to spend. So our C component in aggregate demand will increase. People have more money, right? So they're going to spend more. So C is going up, aggregate demand is increasing. We have a rightward shift in aggregate demand. We are at the new equilibrium. We have more real GDP, more income for everybody. So people are going to spend more. Aggregate demand again will go up for the second time, for the third time. That's the multiplier effect, right? So we had a tax cut, but the aggregate demand will go up over and over and over and over again. That's the multiplier effect. Which one is bigger? Government multiplier effect or tax multiplier effect? The answer is government multiplier effect. So if the government starts spending more money, basically the aggregate demand will increase more. That's why when we have deep recession, tax cut doesn't work. People are losing their jobs, right? They don't have that much money. So even if the government introduces tax cut, it's not going to help them, right? People are not going to spend money, right? They don't have the money, so they cannot really take the advantage of these tax cuts. So when we have recession, especially when we have deep recession, if the government starts spending more in the economy, you can see a boost in aggregate demand faster, right? So sometimes tax cut works, sometimes it doesn't, depending on how much deep we are in the recession, okay? But remember that the government multiplier effect has a bigger impact on aggregate demand compared to the tax multiplier. Now that we know what we mean by this multiplier effect, let's talk about expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy, as I mentioned in the previous video, it's expansion, right? So it happens when we want to expand something in the economy, when we want to boost the economy. So that's right. If you guess, the government runs the expansionary fiscal policy when we have recession. So to deal with recession, the government implements expansionary fiscal policy. The government increases its own spending. The government start issuing those paychecks for us during COVID-19, or the government starts supporting some businesses by giving them subsidies, bailouts, okay? So the government starts spending, or government provides tax cut for people. Both of them, as I explained earlier, will increase the aggregate demand. Both tax cut and increase in government spending will increase the aggregate demand, and that's what we want to have during recession times. During recession times, aggregate demand actually is low because people are not spending. Like right now, people are scared of future. If they have their jobs, if they still have their income, they're going to save because they don't know what will happen tomorrow. And unfortunately, some people lose their jobs during this COVID-19 recession. They don't have the money to spend. Either way, the C component in aggregate demand is going down. So the aggregate demand is falling. To put the economy back on track, the government should either spend more money or provide tax cut. Both of them will increase the aggregate demand, will shift the aggregate demand to the right because of the multiplier effect. And remember, this multiplier effect happened by kind of some sort of a lag, okay? You don't see a huge jump in aggregate demand because you should allow some times for the economy to adjust. The government spends more, aggregate demand will go up a little bit. GDP will grow. So then there is room for us to see a bigger increase in aggregate demand. So it's going to happen step by step, that multiplier effect. So during recession times, the government spends more money or provides tax cut. The goal here is to increase the aggregate demand because aggregate demand is already low. So the goal of the government is to shift the aggregate demand rightward. Why? Remember, we talked about recessionary gap in chapter 12. So the government goal here is to eliminate the recessionary gap because there is a gap between potential GDP and the actual level of GDP. Okay, so to fill that gap, the government should increase the aggregate demand. I will talk about the contractionary fiscal policy in the next video because it's kind of long already. So I'm going to talk about the contractionary fiscal policy in the next video. Okay, stay tuned.